Hi, all. Sorry that I could not be with you today. So, we're going to do the lecture as a recording. So, today we're doing the lecture. As you can see from the asynchronous work, you have a reading to read and a discussion to participate in. Um, if you should get done in class, my A-Day students, if you get done with this lecture early and the discussion that's associated with this lecture, you're welcome to work on the asynchronous work for tomorrow, which is a short reading and a discussion. Both discussions, the discussion for the lecture today and the discussion for the reading for your asynchronous work, are DICE assignments. For my B-Day students, after you watch this lecture and participate in the discussion, please be sure that you completed the asynchronous work from Thursday and you have those ready for next week. Next week is a DICE week. So let's go ahead and get started. Causes of the crash of 1929. So we saw in the course of last week that the great stock market crash of 1929 sent the nation reeling. You got to see how your roles were affected short term and long term by this crash. And today we're going to look at kind of the major causes of why this crash happened, other than people playing the stock market. So let's go ahead and start. These causes of the crash are very important. These notes are going to be super important to you doing well on our assessment that I will be presenting to you next week. All right. So let's go ahead and start. First of all, one of the biggest effects of this stock market crash was the fact that we had just finished fighting a war 10 years earlier. In the 1920s, countries like England and France and Germany were trying to rebuild from the war. As you can see here, this is a picture of one of the famous cathedrals in Paris, Notre Dame, and it even had some structural damage due to World War I. So in order to repair buildings, neighborhoods, countries that were war-torn, countries that were not war-torn were loaning out money so that these countries like France and Great Britain and Germany could rebuild. So part of the reason that our stocks in our companies here in the United States were so inflated and kind of out of touch with reality was the fact that, well, we were loaning a lot of money. Companies were loaning lots of money to European countries to help them rebuild. So many countries were in debt from borrowing money. And here in the United States, many companies and our government were owed money. So that's one of the reasons that this depression is going to get bigger than just the United States, that this Great Depression will be a depression felt worldwide, which is one of the questions that many of you guys had is why, when you read the reading Life in the Breadlines, was the guy from England coming to New York? Was the Great Depression all over the place? And to answer your question, yes, partly because of this, because of the debts that were owed to the United States from these war-torn countries just 10 years earlier. Second major reason for the stock market crash of 1929 was that industrial production, as we saw when we played the simulation the other day, industrial production was really high during the war. We were selling goods, industrial goods, all over to people in our nation and to people in Europe whose productions had gone down because they were fighting a war. Well, in the 1920s, many of these companies didn't realize that one of the reasons they were selling so much was because other countries that were at war and their factories couldn't produce those things. So we kept making products kind of at the same rate, even though there wasn't war anymore. And because of that, we weren't selling as many products. And so warehouses were full of products that were not selling. And that, of course, inflated how much companies were worth. And of course, that's contributed to the stock market crash. It wasn't just happening in factories, farmers were doing the same thing. Farming had decreased after World War I. During World War I, our farmers here in the United States and ranchers, they were helping to supply countries that were at war that couldn't use their land to farm like normal. So once the war ended, our farmers didn't really slow down the amount of crops that they were producing. And that, of course, is going to hurt them because the demand is not there. We get overproduction. What happens is a lot of farmers are now not selling their crops, and so crops are going bad. And of course, that causes the prices of crops to decrease, which is a good thing if you're a consumer. But at the same time, it's a horrible thing if you're a farmer because you're not selling goods for as much, you're not making as much, and more likely, you're overproducing. So you're throwing away a lot of crops in a year. And then, of course, we saw that the way that people were spending, buying on credit, definitely did not help the situation once the stock market crashed. Because what starts to happen is the minute the stock market crashes, companies that need money are calling in the debts and saying, hey, you have credit with us. Where's our money? We need our money. So, of course, that was a bad idea. And then, as we've pointed out over and over, buying stocks on margin, buying stocks with credit, never a good idea. So these are the four major reasons why the stock market crashed. War debt, industrial production overproduction, agricultural overproduction, and loans and credit. So as we saw from your characters and reading about how people were affected by the Great Depression, we saw that on a micro level, most people would be affected some way, somehow, even if they never even played the stock market. Let's look at those stats. Unemployment in the 1930s was at its highest that it's ever been in our nation's history. Now, that's slightly changed. When I used to say that statement, that was prior to our pandemic. Recently, due to our pandemic, these numbers have been tested, meaning we've gotten pretty close to some of these really high numbers that you can see on this graph. 25% unemployment. Normally, our unemployment kind of falls right in here, about 5%. So we see that unemployment reaches a peak around 1933. It takes about 3 years for the stock market crash's effects to be felt by everybody in the United States just within about that 3 to 4 years' time. As you can see, we start to see it get better, although we're still in a pretty good depression, okay? When normally we're at 5%, this is all still very high. And we can see things starting to go down. We get a little bit of a peak here, but then as the decade rolls into the 40s, we see things get a ton better. And as many of you asked in your questions of what would get this better, how would we get out of this depression? And I answered, well, right about here, we start to see World War II happening. Our involvement as a nation in World War II will happen right here, 1941. And then from there out, you can see all through the war, our unemployment rate is very low because we needed people working to help build supplies in factories for our men fighting abroad. This is a picture of the breadlines. And the breadlines were very interesting in terms of the demographic makeup. The crazy thing is that 1 in 4 unemployed men were typically African American. The motto was that they were the first ones fired, last ones hired. There was definitely discrimination of minorities in terms of hiring during the Great Depression. Very few jobs, and many of those jobs were discriminative towards hiring only whites. Some of you asked, how about women? You don't see a lot of women in this breadlines picture. Women at this time in history were not working jobs. Most of them were tasked with taking care of the children. So women did not often work jobs. What we saw women doing were jobs that they could do at home, such as childcare or such as farming and helping out on a farm. But we rarely saw a woman working like at an office or things like that at this time. Mostly women, if they did have a job, it would be something like being a teacher or a nurse. I need you to write down this definition. A depression. It marks a major downswing in the business cycle. It's characterized by reduced industrial production and widespread unemployment. And at this time in history, we fit this definition. The downswing of the business cycle, reduced industrial production, and widespread unemployment, 25%. I think the most important part would be to write down here, 1933. But let me go over this. By the spring of 1930, over a million Americans were out of work. By that December, 13 million Americans were out of work. That was 1/3 of the American labor force. And then, as we saw, the important part to probably write down into your notes is by 1933, 24% of the labor force was unemployed, and manufacturing in factories had decreased by 50%. Makes sense why all of those people were laid off from their job. If at this point you need a few seconds to write down this slide, go ahead and pause the video. That's the beauty of this all, is you can pause it so that you can write this information down. The next thing I want to talk to you guys are about bank failures. Bank failures. So when you guys have your money in a bank, you know that it's safe. That when you return to go to the bank to get your money out of the bank, you know that it will be there. The reason that you know that it'll be there is because we have put systems in place that ensure your money. This is known as FDIC. That's what we have today, Federal Deposits Insurance. So you're allowed to put up to $100,000 in a account, one single savings account, and you're insured that that money will always be there. But if you put $100,000 and 1 cent into an account, that 1 cent is no longer insured. Every account that you have, checking, savings, is insured up to $100,000. That's the guarantee that a bank makes to you when you use their bank to save money. Well, that's a program that won't happen until the mid-1930s. We'll talk about that program later. Prior to there being bank insurance, or what we call FDIC, that did not exist. So when the stock market crashes right here in 1929, many people lose money. Well, what do you do if you lose money? You go to the bank to get some of the money that you have saved, and so you run to the bank to get that money. Well, the problem is that banks don't have everybody's money in a vault. Remember, what banks do is they use the money that you deposit to loan out to other people. So what happens after the crash is many people run to the bank going, I've lost a bunch of money. I'm going to go pull out some money from the bank. And all these people have the same idea. So when they go to the bank to get their money, the bank says to them, sorry, We're out of cash. We've given out all the money that we have. So, because people's accounts were not insured, we did not have a program like that. What happens is we see banks closing because they don't have any more fluid cash money to give out to people that were using their bank to save money. They were trying to call in the loans that they had given out so that they could give people more of their cash money. But those people that had loans didn't have any way to pay them due to the depression or due to the stock market crash. And so therefore, banks failed. What that means is that maybe you went to the bank going to get some cash and you go and there's a sign on your bank that says bank is closed. There was no insurance for individual accounts. What that means is your account, if you had $10,000 saved in your account and the bank was closed due to bank runs and they did not have enough cash to give out to people that had saved money in their bank, that meant you lost that money forever. That money was probably never going to be seen again. So this chart shows the amount of banks that ended up closing short-term and long-term. Over 4,000 banks were closed. That means that all of those people that had saved money in those banks may never have gotten to see that money again because their accounts were not insured. Pretty horrible thought. This is the discussion question that you will do after this lecture. This is in our Schoology. It's one of 2 discussions that we have over the course of these 2 days. Be sure to do that. The last thing I want to talk to you about is some vocabulary that you'll need to know. Vocabulary that'll help you to understand. So, mortgages. A lot of people could not pay their mortgage during the Great Depression. What that is, a mortgage is a loan for your house. Many people's homes would be foreclosed. After you do not pay your mortgage for a couple of months, because the bank is the one that lent you the money to buy the house, and if you don't pay the bank back, then they can repossess your home and foreclose on your home. That was a pretty common thing. Many farmers would lose their farms that way. The bank would repossess the house in hopes to sell it and get some cash money so that they didn't have to close as a bank. But there weren't a lot of people buying. So that was also a good thing for many farmers, because if there weren't people buying the house, then sometimes those farmers were able to stay in the house until they had a buyer. And many times those homes didn't get bought. Once the war will happen, World War II, then some of those farmers will be able to afford once again to buy back their house from the bank. But until that time, mortgage payments were an issue. Blue-collar workers, white-collar workers were all affected by the stock market crash. Let's talk about the difference here. So, a blue-collar worker, let me try and see if I can get this off of there. All right. A blue-collar worker is a laborer, somebody who works for hourly pay. These are people like you're maybe a plumber or a waitress. Okay, they work for hourly pay. Blue-collar workers tended to not play the stock market, but would be affected by the Great Depression because they were some of the first people to be laid off of work, especially in factories. If factories had to close because they weren't selling enough, blue-collar workers faced layoffs. White-collar workers were more of your professional training. These are like your doctors, your stockbrokers. Typically, they're paid on salary. Because they're paid on salary, many times they tend to be, not always, but tend to be the more wealthy of the type of workers. These were often workers that played the stock market and definitely felt the effects of the Great Depression early on, as opposed to the blue collar worker that may not be laid off for a while, 2, 3 years into the Great Depression. All right, we'll stop right there. And what you need to do is make sure that you do the discussion, the in class lecture discussion, and then make sure you've done the discussion for the asynchronous work or reading. All right, class, hope you had a great day, and I will be seeing you again early next week.